It's a pleasure and a privilege to have with us Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, former Minister of State for Education in the former Congress UPA 2 government at the centre. A brief introduction of Dr. Tharoor, an alumnus of Delhi's Blue Chip St. Stephen's College and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at the Tufts University, USA, where he earned his PhD. Dr. Tharoor began his professional career in the United Nations in the late 1970s in the office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and served the cause of refugees unsettled by wars, political persecution, and natural disasters in several countries, including Switzerland, Singapore, and Yugoslavia. Subsequently, he was transferred to the United Nations head office in New York, where he served in various capacities, rising to the position of Under-Secretary General, the second highest position in the UN. After an unsuccessful run for the top job as Secretary General of the UN, in 2008, Dr. Tharoor returned to India, and the following year was elected to the Lok Sabha from the Thiruvananthapuram, formerly Trivandrum constituency, as a Congress party candidate. Since then, despite the BJP wave that swept the country, he retained his Lok Sabha seat in the general elections of 2014 and 2019. A skilled debater, articulate spokesman of the Congress party, Dr. Tharoor is also a prolific, multiple awards-winning author, having written over 20 bestseller, mainly non-fiction books, including An Era of Darkness in 2016, which unsparingly exposed the ugly underbelly of almost 200 years of the British Raj, and his recently published The Battle of Belonging on Nationalism, Patriotism, and What It Means to be an Indian. Moreover, he is widely admired as a wordsmith par excellence, and is arguably the favorite politician of India's fast expanding middle class, with, one hopes, a bright future ahead of him in national politics. Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much for sparing the time for this interview with Education World, promoted in 1999 with the ambitious goal of building the pressure of public opinion to make education the #1 item on the national agenda. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you so much, Dilip, for that very generous introduction. It's a delight to be with you on this forum. I know you as somebody who has pioneered a number of outstanding publications which have taken India's imagination forward in all sorts of ways. You've been at the cutting edge of a lot of changes, and I'm sure EducationWorld will contribute exactly to expanding the areas of possibility in the field of education. So thank you for inviting me.
Although you had a short stint as a Minister of State in the HRD Ministry of the UPA government, you are the education minister the country needs, but never got. What would be your major education reforms if this wish is fulfilled?
Oh, that's very kind of you. I don't think anyone plans to fulfill your wish there, Dilip, but let me say that obviously the list of answers would be so long that we would take up the entire discussion approaching just one question. So let me try and give you a few headlines. Yes. I think it's been, for me, a matter of great frustration that we have not been able to make the kind of progress we need to across the board, starting with something as basic as universal literacy, which, as you know, is climbing towards 80% for men, but is still in the high 60s for women. We need to go all the way in improving from literacy through primary school education, high school education, college, and start off with something as elementary as taking steps to strengthen our gross enrollment ratios at all of these levels, which are in every case below the world average. And it's disappointing. I think I don't disagree with Nehruji's decision that in a time of scarce resources, he could only focus on one sector in the education arena, and he chose to produce some high quality higher education institutions. But the problem with that is they became islands of excellence in a sea of mediocrity. And we really have to do much more to liberate them. I suppose one key word I would have is greater autonomy across the board for institutions. I find our higher education system over-regulated but under-governed. And I think there's a great deal we can learn from the successful systems of countries like the US and others, but the US in many ways is a paradigm for widespread excellence in higher education. So they're moving back down the age curve. High school we have an extraordinarily high percentage of dropouts in the high school level, particularly of females. We're losing girls after puberty by class 8 onwards, in fact, class 6 onwards in many places, for all sorts of reasons, including relatively banal ones, like the absence of decent, usable toilets for girls of a certain age who need to change a few times a day, once a month. And those infrastructural things have to be remedied as well, but equally, of course, the quality of education and gearing it to a way that families consider it actually useful to leave their kids in school than to pull them out is crucial. When it comes to primary education, we got things more or less right with the incentives in the Right to Education Act and the midday meal program, as a result of which parents thought it wasn't a bad idea to let their little ones go to school rather than keep them at home and have them as an extra mouth to feed. But as I said, that's somewhat offset by the dropouts after the 6th grade. So again, we need to fix something, but we also need to ensure that learning outcomes are given more importance than mere numbers. At the moment, the problem is we are putting kids in school. In fact, our gross enrollment ratio at the primary level is now 105%. So we're enrolling more kids than we thought existed at that age, because we're obviously catching some of the kids who missed out earlier and who are coming in now. But the problem is that they're not learning very much. And too many studies have established that the vast majority of our 5th graders cannot read or add or speak at the 2nd grade level. So these are things where we're not getting it right. There's been some very interesting pedagogical research we can rely on. For example, Professor Karthik Muralidharan at Harvard, who's now, I think, moved to California, has done some ground research, which has come up with the fairly unconventional suggestion that primary schooling would be improved, not so much by our usual remedy of saying, let's have more schools, more teachers, smaller classes, all of which makes sense at a certain level. But until we can get there, he suggests we need more teaching assistants to prowl through the class while the teachers are teaching and see who's keeping up, who's not, who needs remedial help, that sort of thing. There's a lot of interesting work there that's being done by scholars, and we ought to grab that. And it can be done better. When you realize that NGOs...
If I might interrupt you for a minute.
Sure.
So one of the great debates has been that, right from 1966, the Kothari Commission recommended that we spend 5%, 6% of our GDP on education, but it's not happened for the past 70 years. Now, how do you explain that? What do you think, as a learned author and a policy analyst, perhaps you can give us an explanation why it has never happened for 70 years?
Well, I must say 6% was perhaps a bit of a fantasy because it was propounded by Mr. Kothari, Dr. Kothari, at a time when our expenditure was well below 2% of GDP. It has climbed up a little bit, but the problem is that governments have always had, in their perception anyway, too many urgent and conflicting demands on the same pot of money to be able to allocate it. It is true that our GDP has grown exponentially since our target was enunciated, and what we're spending today would certainly be much more than 6% of our 1966 GDP. But the point is not that. The point is we really have to look at what education system is spending.
I'm sure you're aware that even the Western countries, which are much bigger GDPs than us, they're spending 6 and 7% of their GDPs. So
they are, but some of that is not necessarily constructive expenditure. I mean, there's no question, for example, that if you look at what it costs to get a college degree in America, it should not logically have cost that much. What it costs to sustain a $20 billion endowment for Harvard. I mean, frankly, as a policymaker, I don't mind if no Indian institution has even a $1 billion endowment because I would rather see that money being put to work today. What concerns me as a policymaker is that Indian parents are today spending $5 billion sending their children to foreign countries to be educated. And therefore, I would have done something to prioritize facilitating the opening of world-class campuses in India so that our parents don't need to send their children abroad. There was a time, but sadly, we may have missed the boat on that, when many foreign countries were looking for opportunities to open campuses in India, and our very restrictive laws prevented that, and no government at that point had the clout or the determination to change those laws. And there was a lot of vested interest when during my brief stint in HRD, we did try to bring in some remedial laws that could have made it possible. The vested interest in the in the political class did not make that possible. So I want to stress to you that getting to change requires not just you and I or outside analysts agreeing on what needs to be done. It needs buy-in from the political establishment, prioritization by the government. When you talk about 6%, it means the finance minister has to agree that this is more important than 10 other things she's being asked for money for. And then finally, we have to come up with a formula that will actually pass through the parliament. But I would like to really make a manful effort, which I don't think, frankly, has been made. One of the questions I asked our current education minister, Dr. Ramesh Pokhriyal Nishank, when he came up with his new education policy statement in the summer during the COVID lockdown, which, by the way, still hasn't come to Parliament, and I've been pestering him to bring it so we can have a proper discussion on it. One of the things I asked him was, I said, I like a lot of the ideas in the NEP, but will you get your government to pay for it? Have you spoken to the finance minister? Have you raised the financial angle of the cabinet in the presence of the prime minister? And he said to me, yes. Now, that's a very reassuring signal. If that is true and if money can be allocated, we won't get to 6% overnight. But if we can start spending more money where it needs to be spent, we might yet transform our educational system.
Yeah. So let's go to the next question that I have. As a historian and political analyst of repute, to what extent do you agree? I think you've answered that question with the statement that human capital development is severely neglected in post-independence India.
Well, severely neglected is perhaps a matter of opinion.
You have 300 million totally illiterate people in this country.
So the fact that there are more children in India who have not seen the inside of a school than exist in the rest of the planet put together is, to me, shaming. The fact that in a country with so many young people of potentially college-going age, that our gross enrollment ratio is still only 23% for university, whereas the world average is 30, and in the developed countries is 66, 67.
60, yes.
So all of these things suggest to me that there has been a certain degree of neglect, severely, as I said, as an editorial comment. Now, the answer that would come to me if Jawaharlal Nehru was still alive or Maulana Abul Kalam Azad was still alive, they'd be saying to us, you must remember the British left us with barely 16% literacy and barely 3,000 colleges in the entire country. Look where we were and look how far we've come. And there I would agree. There's been a tremendous, tremendous change. But I still think some things could have been done differently, better and faster. For example, Sri Lanka was left in much the same mess as we were, but they reached 70% literacy when we were still in the 20s or early 30s. So prioritization is an issue, resources are an issue, and of course, our federal structure has complicated matters a little bit because school education is by and large a state subject. Higher education was seen as the main domain of the central government, and the resources mainly were with the central government. So, you can go to, I still remember with shock my visit to Bundelkhand University and seeing that they didn't have the money, apparently, to hammer a nail above their main entrance door for the sign Bundelkhand University. It was half toppled and askew, but they literally were living from hand to mouth, not able to pay any salary increases to their teachers and so on. So we really have a resource crunch in the states for state universities, state high schools, and we really need to pump much more into it. I think the two bits where resources have gone are elite higher education and basic primary education, that too only more recently since RTE and UPA1, I beg your pardon. But I would say that we now have every opportunity to build on those successes and to expand them throughout the gamut of education policy.
Okay, let's move to the next question, sir. Do you believe that if human capital development, essentially primary, secondary education, had been given high importance in the past 70 years, the India growth story in terms of economic development would have been much more positive?
Well, there is absolutely no question that, as has been observed by many economists way before you and I are talking, none of the developing countries that became economic success stories, the so-called Asian tigers, for example, to the east of us, every one of them put their money and their effort into human capital development first, and the growth followed. So you have to do everything from literacy, education, and skill development, and then you have people who are ready to put their skills, their abilities, and their learning to use to grow your economy. And every single one, I don't think there was, except for India, a successful growing world economy anywhere in the world with a literacy rate as low as ours. and educational outcomes as poor as ours. So yes, if we had done that too, our growth story would certainly have been more rapid and more dramatic.
Just a supplementary question to that, Dr. Tharoor. How satisfied are you that with the academia industry engagement?
Not at all.
Yes.
Not at all. When I was minister, we actually had asked Mr. Narayana Murthy to do a report on this, and he'd done a rather good report on what he called the academia industry interface, which sadly has been gathering dust under our successor government. What struck us, and I've lived a fair amount in the US, is the way in which, for example, in America, if a company has an idea to develop a particular product but doesn't have the skilled staff, researchers, engineers to develop it, they will go to a university and they will say, listen, here's the idea, here's the seed capital. If you've got a bunch of postdoctoral students, even doctoral students, graduate students who are prepared to research this and come up, if they make a viable engineering product out of this, we will develop it, market it, etc., and we'll share the royalties with you. Now, that kind of thing happens routinely in Silicon Valley. It happens routinely in the Raleigh-Durham Triangle in North Carolina. It almost never happens in India. And we should be seeing much more of that. One policy we did introduce, for example, was we bonds of the real marketplace, the real workforce. Employers have been complaining, that when I was a minister, again, I'm going back to that period, there were 3 studies by FICCI, CII, and ASSOCHAM of employer satisfaction with the talent pool available to them. And it was absurdly high as 82% of them said they were not satisfied with the quality of recruits available for hire. And many of them felt that the only remedial solution in India was to hire people and then re-educate them. I don't mean train them. I don't mean on-the-job training. I mean literally a year of extra education to make up for what they either didn't learn or learned badly in the existing curriculums in colleges. So,
as a consequence of that, Dr. Tharoor, in fact, we believe that Indian industry has perhaps the highest education and training costs of any country in the world.
But you go to a campus like Infosys's campus in Mysore, or the TCS campus in Thiruvananthapuram, and you're looking at world-class educational facilities.
Universities, yes.
Which have actually also stolen some of the best teachers for their corporate purposes, because they can afford to pay better than many of our better universities. That's another story.
That's another story. Let's move on, sir. I know you're pressed for time. In your new book, your very new, very engaging book, The Battle of Belonging, you have disparaged neoliberal economics of the new millennium for having deepened income equalities. Well, I don't disparage perhaps now. You have criticized the new millennium. You have criticized neoliberal economics for deepening income inequality in societies around the world and catalyzing the rise of authoritarian governments. On the other hand, the Congress Party's neta-babu socialism and license permit quota raj of half a century, which still lingers, ruined the modest material aspiration of hundreds of millions of citizens of post-independence India. What's your comment?
I think my comment would be, first of all, that if you're quoting my books, you need to go back to India from Midnight to the Millennium, in which I had completely taken apart precisely what you criticize. I had been quite critical of neta-babu socialism and the license permit quota raj at considerable length, I might add. And I only became an acolyte of the Congress Party after the 1991 liberalization. So you and I come from the same place on that subject. In the Battle of Belonging, I would not say I criticized, I would say I described a lot of what has happened in the world in the last 20 years, because I'm trying to understand and explain the rise of certain kinds of strongmen leaders, authoritarians, the Trump kind of rejection of the modern world that we've seen, the extraordinary phenomenon of it being mirrored in everything from Brexit in the UK to Madame Le Pen in France and Mr. Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and arguably many aspects of the BJP's rise in India, all of which asked me the question, why did all this happen? And one of the explanations I found was indeed a backlash to the neoliberal economics of the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus is something which was taken as gospel for a bit too long without asking the basic question we must ask of any reform: who gains, who loses, who are the winners and losers, and will the losers fight back? And that's exactly what's happened, particularly in the developed world, where the entire white working class said, why are we voting for politicians or sending our jobs off to Shanghai? And they have essentially come back and challenged the existing consensus and given us the likes of Trump. So the point is, as I say, it's not so much a criticism of liberal economics, which in our country has been grossly overdue, but rather a criticism or an analysis of the rise of certain kinds of governments and rulers as part of a backlash to the neoliberal consensus. And that backlash has taken two forms. Economics is only one. The other one that we have paid insufficient attention to here is what I might call the cultural backlash. And in those countries, it was a backlash against foreigners, immigrants, minorities. It was a backlash against foreign languages on the streets of the UK. It was a backlash against people of color coming into America, speaking Spanish in some cases, and so on for Donald Trump. And that is mirrored in our part of the world, where we have this backlash against so-called Muslim appeasement and sustained attacks on minorities by the powers that be in India today. So you're looking at a situation where there is a global phenomenon that we must open our eyes and pay attention to. And that's what I've done in my book, The Battle of Belonging. But I would say I do still believe firmly that if anything, my critique of the present government's economic policies would be more from the right of center than from the left of it. That is, I do believe, for example, that in rejecting the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, the RCEP, with the rest of Asia, that we have actually decided on the basis of our fears and anxieties rather than our hopes and aspirations. And I think it was, in my view, a short-term mistake. But our democratic politics, sadly, has almost always been short-term. Our politicians tend to not think beyond the next election. And if a policy is going to create short-term losers, it doesn't matter that you have 300 seats in the Lok Sabha, you're not going to do it. I must admit that the success of the farmers' agitation is going to make Mr. Modi and his friends think even more cautiously before they risk any other reform that might provoke a backlash.
Yes, sir. Now let's move on to the next question, because I presume what you're saying, we have to strike a balance between liberal economics and neta-babu permit Raj. Okay, so my interpretation of the route to the Congress party in general election 2014 and 19 is the public is fed up with Congress socialism and yearns to return to the organic traditions of free market and free enterprises of ancient India and ease of doing business. To what extent do you agree?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with your premise. I agree with the premise that our basic nature, which we can see in Indian immigrants anywhere in the world, is indeed a free enterprise doing business and therefore thriving in market economy. So there I don't disagree with you. Where I think you're being perhaps a bit kind is in ascribing our defeats in 2014 and 19 to just that one argument of economics. I actually think that there were a number of other factors at play, some perhaps not too kind to us and some not too kind to the voters who have supported some very regressive and I must say intolerant policy approaches of the winning party. But so my short answer is that the reasons are more complex than just one thing. But as far as the need of the people to see more freedom for creative activity, I have not only not disagreed with you, I've actually said this myself well before coming into Indian politics. I gave an interview in 1990, which for a while became quite notorious, where I said, I made the observation that now I think is common currency, that it's something that struck me from my service around the world, that the only country where Indians don't seem to flourish is in India. And I said, obviously there's something wrong with our system, that people go abroad and do very well and thrive in the very areas that they're unable to succeed in India. So what are we doing wrong and why can't we fix it? But I must say that 1991 marked a watershed moment. I think there was a genuine sense of possibility. And I think all the transformations, I am old enough to remember pre-91 India very well. And the visual changes, the number of products available, the range of choice available in the education field, since your EducationWorld, literally the number of courses you can take that didn't exist before 91 and the number of career options that open up that didn't exist before 91.
Absolutely.
All of this is a sea change. So let me say that I think liberalization was a very, very good thing for India, and that neta-babu socialism should not be returned to. But I would at the same time stress that we are talking about social justice as well. And when the Congress Party interprets socialism today, it tends to do so much more in the language of social justice. That is, have liberalization, but when the revenues of that liberalization come to the government in the form of taxes and increased revenues generally, that a good portion of them must be spent in giving a leg up to the people who are marginalized and excluded. That is, as I said in Parliament, the magic of the market cannot appeal to one who cannot afford to enter the marketplace. And it's in the interests of the Indian business community, it seems to me, to give a leg up to the poor, because they can be consumers of tomorrow if you don't allow them to remain poor. So let there be a Mahatma Gandhi Nrega program, let there be social welfare programs, assistance, let there be scholarships. We haven't in Education World today talked about scholarships, vital in my view. And I'm constantly berating banks for never meeting that. Public sector banks consistently fail to meet their targets for scholarship loans. And why is that? Because they insist on collateral. And I say your collateral is the brains of the student before you. When that student comes for a loan, look at their grades, look at their record of academic accomplishment. Do not look at whether they own land or a house or gold or anything they can give you. Reward the poorest bright student. If it were left to you, I say to these bankers, and Abdul Kalam would never have grown from being a kid selling newspapers, delivering newspapers in Kanji, in Rameshwaram, to becoming a rocket scientist and the president of India. We need to invest in the brains of the public sector banks. Also have a social responsibility to do that. So I'm just saying social justice means giving people help. And then some of that will be wasted inevitably, but much of it will transform our country. And even rich old America does it. I studied in America on a scholarship.
So there is a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. I think everybody has to the industry has to understand, and especially, but unfortunately, I don't think public sector banks, and that's a good case for nationalization, will ever understand that, for denationalization.
Yeah, sure. In many cases.
So now we move on to the next question, sir. We're coming nearly at the end. Currently, as a member of the 23-member Ginger Group of the Congress Party, you are actively involved in the process of reforming and rejuvenating this 130 years old political party. How satisfied are you with the progress of your initiative?
That's an issue I'd still rather discuss within the party than outside. I'll just say that the issue has been placed on the agenda by those who have submitted this letter. The Congress president has met with a representative group of us, as well as a larger group of people whom she had invited. It was a good, constructive discussion. We are looking forward, I hope sooner rather than later, to the announcement of a process. We understand that the thinking is that immediately after the 5 state elections in our country in May, that there will be an AICC session to elect a new president, and with it there could well be reforms that we have been seeking in the working committee, the Congress Parliamentary Board, and so on. But I think that it doesn't actually help our cause to air these issues so much in public at this stage.
Of course.
We find it more useful to get things done within the party, and we're working as loyal party members. Our only interest is in a successful Congress party, because we're looking at a country which desperately needs a strong and effective opposition, and what we are recommending, we believe, will contribute to that, not detract from it.
So evidently you don't share the view that the Congress party is has been so badly trounced that it's unlikely to be revived. You don't share.
I think that we've been through some bad times in 2 successive elections, but I believe the fundamentals are there, and that we will revive. In any case, I think India needs a strong and effective Congress party. It's like people saying that the Indian economy has been so badly battered ever since demonetization and a series of disastrous decisions by this government that it can never be revived. But you can't give up on the Indian economy. It's the only economy we have, right? So just as we have to revive the Indian economy, we have to revive the Congress party. It's the strongest opposition we have, and it's also the only opposition with a nationwide footprint that can truly take on the might of the ruling BJP.
Yes, thank you. Good answer. Thank you. Uh, Sir, the next question that I have is, the Indian economy has been battered by the coronavirus pandemic, with an estimated 18 million jobs lost and 30 million children having dropped out of school. How soon do you expect the economy to recover to its 10% plus economic growth momentum?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, when you look at the education scenario, you're quite right to mention kids dropping out of school. I mean, a lot of the reason that kids were sent to school, as I said, from poorer families and in rural areas, was actually to get things like the midday meal and to be put to productive learning in the school environment. If they're sitting at home and the parents have to feed them anyway, the parents may as well put them out to work in the fields or in sewing carpets and footballs and God knows what else. And that's been a real tragedy. It's actually been a regression for us. That also links into the stark digital divide in our country. We blithely think we can educate children online, but how can we? Does everybody in our population afford a mobile phone, let alone a computer or a laptop or anything that can connect to the internet? Even if they could afford a mobile phone, would it be a smartphone? And would it be one where they could afford an internet data pack that they could let their kids sit 8 hours a day in front of and learn lessons from? Would there be enough electricity for that and where they are? You know, in a country where so many of the basics still have to be conquered, we just cannot ignore the challenges that the Indian reality poses to creating an online education solution to the problems of the coronavirus. So I really hope that we can learn through whatever combination of events, vaccinations, herd immunity, even if it means that we go through a short spasm of our healthcare services being overwhelmed, that I hope we can soon get back to normal schooling, normal college life, normal work life, both to revive the economy and to revive education. As far as numbers are concerned, obviously 7% to me is still a dream. Nobody is projecting anything realistically like that. The most optimistic figure I've seen for the current fiscal year is -8%. The most pessimistic has it below 10%, 10.3% negative growth. So we first have to overcome that negative before we can get into the positive. Some people are telling me we'll probably grow faster in 21, that is 20 to 21, than we will grow in 21 to 22. If so, that'll be a disaster, and I'm not looking to that. Maybe what they meant was in the coming fiscal year that's going to start with the budget that is 22. That's right. That the budget that is yet to be announced may offer an adequate stimulus to growth, because certainly the over-dramatized announcements last year of 20 lakh crore in stimulus, which turned out actually to be barely 1.2 lakh crore, that kind of stimulus is desperately needed. Tax incentives for people to, I mean, those who have money are sitting on it and not investing it. And those who don't have money are looking desperately for ways to earn it. In some ways, this is a perfect moment to unleash another dream budget on the nation and then put India back to work. Let's hope they do, but 7% is still a couple of years away, in my view. If it happens sooner, I'll be as happy as any member of the government or the ruling party.
So you're not expecting a V-shaped recovery then?
No, I've seen this interesting observation that, I suppose looking at it sideways, that it's more likely to be a K-shaped recovery, in that there will be a kind of plateau after the plummeting. We plummeted from where we were to where we are now, that the plateau will continue for a bit, and then we will gradually pick up, and it'll be a kind of slow curve for the bottom part of the K.
Then how
we'll have to see. How
do you explain the booming stock market crossing the 50,000?
You know, it's sad in some ways, the disconnect between the stock market and the lived economic reality of most Indians. I mean, the fact is that those Indians who are not invested in the stock market have nothing to smile about. We have the highest unemployment rate ever recorded in Indian history, ever since figures started being kept. We have an economy essentially that has plummeted to its lowest depths. And we are now looking at the stock market booming, including, by the way, through foreign money coming in and investing in the stock market rather than investing in real ventures that create real jobs. But if these companies whose valuations have shot up because of stock market investments can translate some of that into genuine investments on the ground, it would be a real blessing. I would frankly much rather see massive investments being given in the budget for investors to come in as sort of angel investors and stimulate entrepreneurship in this country. I mean, those very large capitalists who are sitting on their behinds and not investing in the economy don't deserve more money being, flowing into their share values. The youngsters with ideas who can't raise money to implement those ideas, they're the ones who need money, but we haven't got a very enlightened policy on this. I don't know if you remember, Dilip, a couple of years ago, I took issue with the late Arun Jaitley on his budget when he had offered a 3-year tax holiday for startups. And I said, how many startups do you know that make a taxable profit in their first 3 years? I said, you'd be far better off giving incentives to angel investors instead of taxing them and letting them, in fact, have every reason to give money to companies rather than offering a meaningless tax holiday. He took note. And I believe that that's what led eventually to the last budget giving a break to angel investors. So I'm told that the tax authorities did not implement that and have continued taxing investments. So we are in many ways dysfunctional as a government when it comes to economic policy. And that is one example of something which can so easily be fixed if the government would take its responsibilities seriously and crack the whip.
Yes. So now we're coming to the end of this interview. Looking to the long term, sir, say 2050, how optimistic are you that India can develop its human capital, the world's largest child and youth population, and catch up to start with neighboring China in the global development race?
When you said 2050, I was going to react that I've already smashed my crystal ball yesterday. But let me react seriously to your question, because this is such an important one. I used to argue during my brief stint in the education ministry that education is not just a socio-economic issue, it's a national security issue. What did I mean by that? That essentially the troubles in the world, and even in our own country, where at that point we counted Maoist attacks for ill or for bad, one small one to a big one, in 165 districts out of our 700 plus districts. I said, who are these people? These are basically young people who have not been equipped through education, training, and skill development to take advantage of the opportunities that a 21st century economy might offer them. And I said, what we need to do is to give these people a greater stake in India's future, because it's their future, rather than leave them to be seduced by misguided ideologues offering them 1,000 rupees and a Kalashnikov, which is what has happened in so many places. So that message, which I tried to repeat in a number of speeches and interviews, remains, to my mind, 6 years later, 7 years later, completely valid. That we absolutely have no choice. Well before 2050, we need to take advantage of this demographic dividend. I'll give you a couple of figures. The ILO published a report saying in 2020, India has had, now I guess we'll say 2020, 116 million young people in the job starting age profile of 19 to 23. Whereas in that same age bracket, China has only 93 million, which means only 93 million. We have 116 million, China has 93 million. Now, what does that mean, Dilip? It means that we have essentially the demographic advantage of being able to be the dynamo, the engine for the world that China was for a generation, because they don't have as many young people as we have. And yet, sadly, we have not been able to take advantage of this opportunity because of the inadequacy of our preparation for these young people in terms of education, training, and skill development. I would again put this on the war footing. I mean, one of the ideas I had, which was never adopted even by my own government, was to challenge every company of a certain size to put up a training facility that would train people in the vocation that company was involved. If you're manufacturing tires, it would be a vocational training school in tire manufacturing. If you're manufacturing engines, it'll be an engine repair, whatever. And there'll be no obligation on you to hire the people you train, though you would have first dibs on taking the best if you wanted to, but the rest would leave with a certificate that would make them prized in the job market. We have a ridiculous situation, for example, a country as large as ours, with ongoing construction everywhere before the lockdowns anyway, that we have a nationwide shortage of masons, of certified diploma-holding masons. Why? Because every single mason with a certificate or a diploma was actually working in the Gulf. Foreigners require paperwork. So all the Indians who had equipped themselves with paperwork, they went and they made good money elsewhere. And we are stuck with people who have only learned their skills on the job and may actually not have learned them well. We don't know. Some have, some haven't. we need to formalize that much more effectively. So all this kind of thing, human development, human capital, is about ensuring that your people are ready to contend with the world. When it comes to the upper end of the education profile, there's an Oxford Martin School study that says that in 2030, 30% of the jobs in the world will be jobs that don't exist today. Yes. How do you prepare or train or educate a kid for a job that doesn't exist? Not by mugging out of a textbook, not by doing rote learning and preparing for exams, because everything they've learned is about yesterday. In any case in today's world, in the real world, in any job they might do, facts and figures of the kind they could learn for an exam, they can find with 2 clicks of the mouse on Google. What they need is not to be told what to think. They need to be trained in how to think, how to deal with unfamiliar information, grasp it, analyze its essentials, find a way of proceeding with it. That responsibility, that kind of out-of-the-box thinking, that kind of intellectual creativity is the only kind of education that will prepare our young people to deal with a world in which the job they'll be doing 10 years from now, 9 years from now, we're in 2021, will be a job that doesn't exist today. And that's why we really need to reorient the educational system. So in my last answer, I'm tying it back to my first answer when you asked me what kind of reforms would you want. The biggest reform I never got to when you understandably interrupted me since I was waxing too eloquent. The biggest reform has got to be in how we teach and how we get our students to think. But I would just end with one short slogan: take education seriously. That, to my mind, is a message that this talk should give all those who've been watching it.
Yeah, Dr. Tharoor, Education World is certainly on the same page as you are. It's a very inspiring talk, articulate as usual, and concise and to the point. Thank you very much.